What I'm going to talk about, but my current role is as the Dean of the 12th and newest school of O.P. Jindal Global University, the Jindal School of Public Health and Human Development. And for those of you who have attended other sessions, you might have heard me talk about human development. It's a concept that was developed by a very famous Indian philosopher and economist, Amartya Sen, and it provides a framework for challenging the traditional understanding of development as being growth in terms of GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, economic growth should not be the definition of what development is. It should be a means rather than the end of development. Development is to reach objectives for people's well-being so that they can be happy. So that's what our school is all about. And my background, however, and I'm doing that by way of telling you why am I talking about international jurisdiction over questions from a legal perspective, and that's because even though my current role is in the field of public health, most people who have positions of responsibility in public health come from a medical training. I don't. I come from the training that you have, training in law, with a specialization on international law and human rights. So now you can understand that with that background, the subject of accountability for atrocity crimes and the situation in Gaza is the sort of problem that we focus on. And I'm going to try to share with you today, let me attach this, I'm going to try to share with you today some of the core ideas that will help you understand what are the options available to hold people accountable for and to prevent in the future crimes of the type we are observing in Gaza today. Who is responsible? What can be done about it? What role does law have to play? What is the effectiveness of law in all of this? And we're going to, after we've done this, we're going to have this simulation for the roles that you've all read about so that you will be able to act out a position. If you are from the Israeli government and a judge is saying, we charge you with the crime of genocide, what are you going to say? Not guilty. Not guilty. Not only not guilty, but not guilty. You have no right to even try me here. I'm a national of another country. I shouldn't even be, you shouldn't have any right to say anything to me. So, you're going to play those roles, act them out. Somebody else is going to be a representative of an organization that deals with humanitarian assistance in Gaza. And he's going to say, I saw this firsthand. I was there. I saw this thing. There is no justification. That's a crime. You must be punished for that crime. So, you see what I mean about acting out the roles, and you can see that I like to act things out. So here we are. We're going to talk about applicable law. So this is a law school. First thing you want to know is, in a situation like we're witnessing in Gaza, what is the applicable law? What is the concept of impunity? And for many people, you probably have encountered this concept in law already, but most other people don't really know what impunity means. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I put in inverted commas the expression entrenched impunity, because one of the leading figures in the international debates concerning Gaza used this expression, entrenched impunity. What does that mean? And then we're going to talk about jurisdiction, because if we decide that there is a law that declares some of the acts being committed to be criminal, who can try it? Where can you bring the case? And the simulation will be one example of that. And then I'm going to broaden the issue to the wider question of international relations that has to do with root causes. Gaza is not just a problem in which people in the Israeli government have made decisions that do harm to the Palestinian population. Why are they doing that? But there's a broader question. What are the root causes? Why does Israel feel the need to take such action against Hamas? Are they justified in doing that? Are they protecting their population from terrorism? Are they protecting their state from violations of its sovereignty, self-defense? What are the rules that apply? But deeper than that, when massive violations of population's rights, of survival of people, massive deaths occur, 35,000 deaths occurring, for example, in Gaza. What framework exists in international law and relations to address that, to stop that? After all, if you remember, at the end of World War II, the governments of the world met in San Francisco to draft the Charter of the United Nations. And that document opens with the words, "To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war that twice in our lifetimes," to people all over the world. Now, if you put yourself in that situation, if you think of 1945, and India was there. India was represented in San Francisco at the time. All the great minds of the world representing their governments were sincerely believing that they want to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war that twice in our lifetimes has brought untold misery to human beings. What scourge of war that is bringing untold misery to populations? What rules have been developed? What was the international legal and political order that sought to prevent this from happening? And what can be done about it? So that's a pretty ambitious topic for the day. If I may start, and if AV works, before the current situation in Gaza, the principal source of horror in the Middle East, in addition to Yemen and Sudan and places like that, was Syria. And this is the trailer of a film called For Sama, and I think it captures very well the type of situation we're dealing with, a special focus. You know that one of the issues in Gaza are the attacks on hospitals. How could you ever justify bombing a hospital? Well, Israel says, hospitals are where they hide the militants of Hamas. So obviously we are acting in self-defense. We need to eliminate Hamas, and if they're hiding in a hospital, that's where we're going to get them. What are the consequences of that? Does law allow that? Is that a punishable offense? Let me begin by giving you the background of this film that takes place. Nope, I'm afraid we're not getting it. I'm very sorry. We're not getting Wi-Fi here. Let's see if I can do it this way. Yes, I have to exit the play.
بحلب مدينتي لسه عم صور. هذا الشيء اللي عم بيخلي معنا لوجودي. ما حدا منا كان عنده أي فكرة.
Sorry, I'm trying to make this bigger because when I put this in play mode, it turns off. I'll try one more time in play mode. No, it's not going to work in play mode, so I'm going to have to... miracle.
بحلب مدينتي.
Aleppo. Has anybody been to Aleppo?
لسه عم صور. هذا الشيء اللي عم بيخلي معنى لوجودي. ما حدا منا كان عنده أي فكرة كيف رح تتغير حياتنا للأبد.
حمزة أنا حامل. سما سما
سما، عملت هالفيلم مشانك. بدي إياك تفهمي شو اللي كنا عم نقاتل مشانه. بحبك كثير أكثر من
شو في ضرب كثير اليوم؟
سما، أنا بعرف إنك عم تفهمي شو عم بصير. بقدر شوف هالشي بعيونك. ما عم تبكي مثل أي طفل عادي. وهذا الشيء اللي عم يحرق لي قلبي. سما، رح تسامحيني؟
That film, I've met the woman who made the film, is the woman who married a doctor in a hospital in Aleppo and had that baby. And so she's in the hospital with her husband when it's bombed, and she is making the film for her baby daughter to apologize for having had this child be born in a situation of armed conflict. I'm showing this film because, A, it's a very good film that shows the situation in Syria. 2, because Syria touches me very much. Part of my career was to study at the University of Damascus. I'm very attached to the people and country of Syria. 3, it is a situation of horrible civil strife on a conflict that started as what is called an internal armed conflict. I'm using a technical term of international humanitarian law, and has become an international armed conflict because of the role that Russia and other countries have played in this struggle. So it gives an example of the reality of armed conflict in a country that is not unlike Gaza. The situation and root causes in Syria and in Gaza are quite different. We're going to talk about that. But our main purpose today is to understand what is the law involved and what role can law have in this. And will this play?
The UN Security Council began its meeting with a moment of silence for the victims, the only action it's agreed on in 4 weeks of fighting, then turned to the spiraling health crisis in Gaza. Describing corridors crammed with the injured, the sick and dying, morgues overflowing, and surgeries without anesthesia, the head of the World Health Organization pleaded for aid.
Half of the Gaza Strip's 36 hospitals and 2/3 of its primary healthcare centers are not functioning at all. Those that are functioning are operating way beyond their capacities. The health system is on its knees.
In addition to caring for 27,000 wounded, hospitals are trying to manage the regular health needs of more than 2 million people, including pregnant women and cancer patients, while tens of thousands of displaced people shelter there. Even as they met, Israel was bombing Gaza's biggest health facility, the Al-Shifa hospital.
They are looking at you
imploring you to act to stop another possible massacre unfolding.
Israel's been accusing Hamas fighters of sheltering near and in tunnels under hospitals, a claim contested by health workers in Gaza and independent experts. Council members also pointed to the fact that 70% of victims are women and children.
Every single one of the 2,650 currently reported as trapped under the rubble are human beings, and that more than half of them are children. But they're not just children, they're Palestine's future, and they're also Israel's future neighbors.
A number of council members called out Israel for violations of international law and lamented that the Security Council was unable to uphold peace and security. The Director General of the WHO saying it no longer serves the purpose for which it was established. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel.
That last sentence is fundamentally important to what this whole session is about. The Security Council was called upon to act. You saw the images from the Security Council, in which a moment of silence everybody agreed to hold for the victims in the hospitals that were taking place. Parallel, Syria, victims in the hospital. The similarity is present, but the scale is much greater. What can the principal organ responsible for peace and security in the world do about that? That was the challenge that was expressed at the end of the video that we just saw. One more video and then I'll get
Israel's response to Hamas's terrorist attack has prompted criticism and protest. But is it breaking the rules of war?
That's your
Article
question for today.
51 of the United Nations Charter specifies that states have the right of self-defense. They are allowed to defend themselves from armed attack. What lawyers have agreed over time since is that a state can use force as long as it is necessary to do so. In other words, if you have to use force to address a threat or the reality of an armed attack, and as long as your force is proportional to the threat that you face. So for instance, if you had a state attack you on a low level, you wouldn't be allowed to use nuclear weapons to simply flatten the state in response. That would be disproportionate. Israel has for many years kept the Gaza Strip under a state of blockade. And in recent days, Israeli ministers put the Strip under a complete siege, stopping all food, electricity, water, fuel. And what lawyers say to me is that while a blockade can be legal, that there is a prohibition in international law on starving civilians. And many of them say that the tightening of the Israeli blockade into a full siege could potentially violate that prohibition and make this a potential war crime.
On October 18th, during a visit to Israel by President Joe Biden, Israel did say it would allow food, water and medicine to enter Gaza from the southern crossing in Egypt.
International humanitarian law that governs how armies target things on the battlefield is really clear. It says that armies can never, under any circumstances, deliberately target civilians or civilian objects. But there are some lawyers who are concerned that Israel's definition of what counts as a military object has stretched that idea to breaking point. For instance, some say that Israel considers that if a building was once used by Hamas, and even if Hamas leaves, that the building might still count as a military object that can be legitimately targeted in an airstrike. There are some observers who say that Israel's attacks in Gaza, whilst highly destructive, aren't necessarily more destructive than other urban wars we've seen in the past, whether that's America in Fallujah or the Iraqi army in Mosul attacking Islamic State a few years ago. So these legal debates are really intense, and I think it's safe to say that they're really contested.
Okay, so you're all conscious of this background, this situation, what's being discussed there. But there's some key points that were raised. That last interview was with an international lawyer, referring to the obligations of IHL. Let me ask this gentleman here, what is IHL? You want to? IHL. Who wants to help him? I'm doing this on purpose. I don't want to embarrass you. The whole idea is to let everybody think, yes? Very good. International humanitarian law. That's what he referred to. He said, according to the rules of international humanitarian law, civilian targets must be protected and that the rule of proportionality applies. So, one of the takeaways that you have before we even begin our overview is that there's something new, some new branch of law that might be new to most of you, called international humanitarian law, but because it's no longer new to you, you can now talk like the rest of us and say IHL. So in the future, when you're in settings where people talk about what is the applicable law here, you can say IHL, right? You can say that, because now you know what it means. What does IHL mean? Yes, international humanitarian law. So let's understand what that means. That's on the applicable law. You've been reading in the papers and following the decision taken just a few days ago, just 3 days ago, by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Today I'm filing applications for warrants of arrest before the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court on the situation in the state of Palestine. So this is another new term for you. Some of you may have heard of ICC before. After today, when you hear IHL, ICC, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. So, one of the purposes of today's session is to use such core ideas as IHL and ICC, a body of law and a tribunal with responsibilities for making judicial decisions, to put that in the broader context of the full range of relevant bodies of law and the full range of relevant jurisdictions and institutions. So, my purpose today, to give you an opportunity to put into practice in the simulation, is to discuss the applicable law. Let me come back to the... So I'm going to talk, as I said, about the applicable law, the concept of impunity, jurisdiction, and the broader issue of how do we save populations from mass atrocities. And so now we can come to the applicable law. Now, you saw the prosecutor talk about an arrest warrant to be issued by the International Criminal Court against the Prime Minister of Israel, one other minister, and 3 senior officials of Hamas. All of them are going to be brought to trial. They can only be brought to trial in The Hague, which is where the ICC is located, if there is a violation of law that is a different body of law from the law that's applicable in Israel. What is that law? Well, international law has many branches. The law that's applicable to relations among states, as you know, is called international law. And we distinguish, and you probably have courses in this, public international law and private international law. But there are other branches of international law that are relevant. There's international law relevant to refugees, called international refugee law. There's international law relevant to human rights, called international human rights law. And there's international law relevant to behavior that has been defined in international law as criminal. And that's ICL, International Criminal Law. So international criminal law is the body of law that comes from various sources and various types of crimes, but that treat certain behaviors as crimes. And there are different treaties and customary international law, different sources of international law that define the crimes. For example, the first human rights treaty adopted in the United Nations is the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It creates a legal obligation on states to make it a crime to be involved in genocide, to punish people involved in genocide, and to cooperate internationally with the repression and punishment of the crime of genocide. That's one feature of international criminal law. Hijacking, drug trafficking, all these things are crimes that have been defined internationally and subject to international law. In the case of Gaza, we do have various crimes under international law that are claimed. Crime of apartheid has been claimed. Crime of violations of humanitarian law, crimes of aggression, crimes of what are the other crimes that have been included? We're going to hear that when the simulation occurs, where the prosecutor will define the crimes. Let me jump down to the one, number 3, the one we've already talked about, because we now have a world authority here in the second row on IHL, right? You're now somebody who can tell all of your colleagues that international humanitarian law is the body of law that seeks to limit the effects of armed conflict and to protect people in armed conflict from preventable harms. In a war, it is expected that combatants will kill each other. That's a horrible thing. We were supposed to have built a world order that saves succeeding generations from the scourge of war that twice in our lifetime has brought untold misery on people. But war has not been eliminated. It is, of course, if the war is the result of an act of aggression invading the territory of another country, that's a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. That prohibits the use of force. But whether the war is legal or illegal, in other words, Israel is claiming that it is engaged in armed conflict only for self-defense. Israel was attacked on the 7th of October, and it is responding under the rules of international law that allow states to engage in self-defense. Conflicts occur for many, many other reasons. International humanitarian law says, I don't care what started this. We have accepted a body of law that protects affected populations. Now, does anybody know what the principal, I'm going to come to this in greater detail, but to anticipate, what is the principal international document that tells us what international humanitarian law rules apply, that define the rules that protect people in time of armed conflict? Anybody have any sense of what convention or conventions provide the definitions of the laws that protect people who are not or are no longer participating in hostilities and restrict the means and methods of warfare? Where would you look for that? You're future lawyers, somebody says, what are the rules governing people who are no longer participating in conflict? Let's say prisoners of war, or wounded, or shipwrecked people in a conflict, or the civilian population in occupied territory. Where would you look for that? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Wait, everybody. Did you say the Geneva Convention? Do you want to correct that? Geneva? Plural. You added an S, right? Yes. I thought I heard that. Okay. She's so bright. So she added the S, the Geneva Conventions. In 1949, 4 conventions were adopted by the international community and have been accepted all over the world as both treaty law and customary international law that fulfill the purposes of IHL by protecting the wounded and sick, the shipwrecked, prisoners of war, and civilian populations in armed conflict. And they're well defined, and in fact, I'm going to come to this in a minute, but for your own legal research, when you want to get into the very detailed analysis of, as we saw in the international lawyer who was explaining on the screen, that we have to, that force can be used if it's proportional to the need. How do we define that and clarify that? You can go to a source and find a very detailed explication of the content of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions set out in treaty form with very good articles the core ideas. But when you want to apply them in a conflict situation, to know whether the hospital where Sama was born or the hospital that we saw in Gaza is or is not a justifiable target, there's a source you can go to for that. And, well, you probably know, since you know the Geneva Conventions, where would you go to find out more detailed information on the application of IHL? Okay, it's very easy, and it's going to be on the screen in a minute. It's called ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. It has a very good website that links to its analysis of this body of law. So, we've just learned that there's a body of law called ICL, International Criminal Law, and crimes such as war crimes, violations of this law is called war crimes and other crimes under international law are part of international criminal law. The law that applies in time of armed conflict to protect populations is called international humanitarian law and is detailed. But there's another concept we're going to learn that seeks to address the question of how do we protect populations from massive harm? Whether it's genocide or crimes against humanity or massive killing or bombing of hospitals, how do we protect populations? And the international community has worked for many years since the adoption of the UN Charter in 1945, for many years to come up with a solution to this, because we have in the Charter of the United Nations a mechanism that is supposed to protect international peace and security, but it doesn't work. So, the international community came up with the concept of responsibility to protect, which require all states to use all means necessary to end genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. What does that mean? Where does it come from? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But since I started with IHL, and thank you very much for referring to the Geneva Conventions, all of you, have you taken courses on human rights law yet? No courses? Can you raise your hand if you've taken a course in human rights? There are no courses? You don't have a course on human rights here. Okay. One of the branches of international law, oh yes. You do have courses on human rights. Yes. Yes. So, all of these issues are the subject of courses that you have here, and I just wanted to share with you one approach to understanding if human rights law is supposed to protect humans, and international humanitarian law is supposed to protect humans, don't we have a confusion here? What's the applicable law? So one way of comparing where human rights law and international humanitarian law intersect, and this might be a little bit too abstract for some of you, but let me try anyway, if you can follow me. International human rights law are the provisions of law that have emerged in international relations following the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various conventions that have sought to transform the principles of the UDHR into binding law through covenants and treaties and so on that define legal obligations. And that occurs at the global level through UN treaties on human rights, at the regional level through regional organizations' own charters on human rights, and through national law. And the framework of international humanitarian law is designed to function. If we take the situation in a country on a spectrum from peace to war, with all the different things in between of civil war, of conflict, of acts of violence, and so on. That's the reality that we live in. International human rights law was designed to have the maximum protection when you're in time of peace. All the rights apply, every detail applies. Freedom of expression, freedom from torture, right to health, right to all the human rights are supposed to be fully implemented in time of peace. When things get difficult, there are certain limitations that are tolerated, and when you get to a situation of civil war or armed conflict, you cross a line where you might have what is called a national emergency threatening the life of the nation, when certain human rights can be suspended for the duration of that national emergency threatening the life of the nation. And when you get to international war, it's even harder. But there's a baseline here. The baseline here has a term borrowed from Latin for the norms that apply even in the most horrendous situation of armed conflict and violence and so on. And those are principles of jus cogens. Peremptory norms, and another term, if you want to demonstrate your newly acquired skills in international law, peremptory norms of international law that apply even if a state has not ratified a treaty, even if you have a time of war and so on. There's certain norms that apply in all those circumstances. One example is prohibition of torture. If you're in a time of war, you're still not allowed to capture the enemy and torture the enemy for whatever purposes you might have in mind. So this is the baseline, respect for the norms having the character of jus cogens. Human rights protection is expected to be at its highest when the society is in relative peace. Relative conflict, there are certain limitations and derogations on human rights that are allowed. Obviously, if you have a pandemic, are you going to allow complete freedom of religion so people can gather in a temple or a mosque and be close to each other and spread the disease? Of course not. But what happens to the freedom of worship? You restrict it justifiably under those requirements that the international lawyer that we saw on the screen reminded us are the principles of necessity and proportionality. So, but international humanitarian law, or the international law of armed conflicts, is the opposite. In time of peace, do you need to have rules saying you can't bomb hospitals? No, because in time of peace, nobody's bombing hospitals. It's not an issue. The only obligation you have in time of peace, and this is an obligation of the Geneva Conventions, that you must train your military personnel in the Geneva Conventions, in IHL. Okay, that's in peacetime. You're in the classroom with the military. You teach them about that. That's a peacetime activity. But the law was established not for peacetime, but when you move up here. And here, the applicability of the law increases as you approach civil war, wars of liberation, and international war. You get the point? That both human rights law and humanitarian law seek to protect people. One is strong in time of peace and has some relevance in time of war. The other one is strong in time of war and has some relevance in time of peace. Was that clear? Or is this too abstract? Let me move on. So, thanks to our friend here, who's an authority on IHL, here's an opportunity to see what the ICRC does in its advisory services on international humanitarian law. Again, IHL protects persons who are not or are no longer participating in hostilities and restricts the means and methods of warfare. It's also known as the law of war or the law of armed conflict. As you saw in here, I called it the International Law of Armed Conflict, but it's also international humanitarian law. According to IHL, health establishments and units, including hospitals, should not be attacked. This protection extends to the wounded and sick, as well as medical staff and means of transport. This symbol is familiar to you. It's the symbol of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the body in Geneva that is responsible for monitoring and implementing IHL. Very important for the topic that we're talking about today. Now, does this symbol bother some of you? What might that symbol suggest to some people? Does that look like a religious symbol? Oh my goodness. I have a hard time getting people to react. Anybody want to jump in? Looks like a cross, yes, and a cross represents what religion? Sorry? It's a red cross, yes. It's a red cross, but if you understand that as being, oh, this must be some Christian organization that is trying to do it, this has been a problem for the ICRC. Of course it is not. The ICRC sometimes says this is actually 5 squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 squares. And in order to allow national organizations that support the ICRC to be better understood by their people, there has emerged a society of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So there are organizations that are pursuing the purposes of the Red Cross, that use the Red Cross and accept the ICRC's clarification that it is not a religious symbol at all. It is a traditional symbol that was invented in the 19th century to identify vehicles that are carrying health and medical personnel, and it's a convenient symbol to do that, nothing to do with a Christian cross. But for countries that are very sensitive to this, Islamic countries, they have national organizations that don't have a red cross, they have a red crescent, the crescent of the moon. And interestingly enough, Israel has one with the Mogen David, the Star of David, replacing the Red Cross. But this was an issue 20 years ago, and countries don't talk about it anymore. We're kind of back to accepting the Red Cross. But I thought I would mention that just so you're conscious of this. So we're talking about the applicable law. And in the case before us, Israel's response to the attack of the 7th of October. The Security Council of the United Nations, which we're going to remind ourselves later on when we discuss R2P, is the part of the United Nations in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter that has the responsibility to ensure international peace and security, including taking measures involving the use of force to put an end to acts of aggression or violations of international law and international peace. To protect the peace, the Security Council is the body of the UN that has the authority to take action and stop any violations of peace or mass atrocities. So, why do we have a war in Ukraine? Why do we have the atrocities in Gaza when the institution was built to protect us from that. Does anybody want to venture an explanation if you've been following the news at all? I'm going to come back to the Security Council and what it has said, Gaza. But prior to that, the Security Council exists for the sole purpose of ensuring international peace and security. Russia's aggression in Ukraine is a violation of international peace and security. It's a flagrant violation of one of the most important provisions of the UN Charter, Article 2.4, which prohibits any violation of the territorial integrity or political independence of another country. The Security Council is supposed to protect the world from that. Israel has been accused of going beyond exercising its right of self-defense, which is guaranteed in the Charter as well, going beyond that and committing acts of genocide, apartheid, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Security Council is the body that's supposed to solve that, settle that. Anybody have a quick answer as to, there's a 4-letter word that gives the quick answer to why the Security Council created to stop violations of peace and security has been unable to carry out those functions. Anybody? 4-letter word, begins with V and ends with O. Veto power, veto power, okay, veto power. So, long complicated story, we'll come back to it later when we talk about R2P, but the problem is that the Security Council requires the affirmative vote of the 5 permanent members, along with a majority of the remaining non-permanent members of the Security Council. And when you have a situation like Ukraine, where Russia is a permanent member, you're not going to get you're going to get a veto. That means the refusal to have all 5 permanent members agree to a resolution. Same thing with Gaza. And however, the Security Council, nevertheless, with respect to the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestine question, is able to reaffirm that all parties must adhere to their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law as applicable. So I only put this in here to say that the Security Council is not asleep. It's addressing the issue. Efforts have been made for the Security Council to take effective action. The veto prevents it from doing so, but it nevertheless affirms, I'm talking now about applicable law, affirms that this body of law must be respected by all parties in that conflict. It reiterates, this is the Security Council, that all parties to the conflict comply with the obligations under international law, including humanitarian law, with due regard to the conduct of hostilities, etc., and calls on all parties to adhere to international humanitarian law and deplores all attacks against civilian and civilian objects, as well as violence and hostilities against civilian and all acts of terrorism. So in this case, we didn't get a veto from the US and Russia. They abstained. They said, all right, you didn't say that we require Israel to implement a ceasefire. Didn't say that. So they didn't have to oppose it. They didn't have to veto it, the veto power. But because they're not too happy with, for whatever reasons, with the Security Council reaffirming that you must protect civilians, since Russia is not doing it and in Ukraine and Israel is not doing it in Gaza, they abstained. The 13 other countries voted in favor of this resolution, reminding states of their obligations under international law. So this is my first point, is the applicable law. There's international criminal law that's applicable, there's international humanitarian law that's applicable, there's international human rights law that is applicable in this country, and the highest body of the United Nations, the Security Council, has reminded countries of their firm obligations to respect those bodies of law. Now, there's a new concept here that I found and many students have not heard of before, and that's the concept of impunity. How many of you have heard of the term impunity? Okay. It's 2 people, or are the rest of you asleep? 3 people, 4 people, but they're all faculty. Come on, students haven't heard it? No? Okay, there, 1, yay, thank you. All right, I'm not going to ask you to define it because I want to make sure we allow enough time for the simulation. This simulation is designed to make you aware that the challenge that this conflict in Gaza represents, and that the effort by the prosecutor, the ICC, and the efforts that you're going to act out in the simulation, and the efforts to get the Security Council to move and so on, are all designed to address the point that individuals who commit acts that violate the laws that we've just been referring to, human rights law, humanitarian law, international criminal law, and so on, that have personal responsibility for these violations, should be held accountable. And the fact that they are not held accountable has a name. The name is impunity. Now can I ask, can you see this from here? Can you see? Could you read the sentence there? Thank you very much. Did you know this definition before, or is this new? It's new. Okay. So I assume that that's true for many of you. Remember this term. It's an important term. It applies in domestic law, and it applies in international law. And in international law, an effort has been made to adopt the UN principles for the protection and promotion of human rights through action to combat impunity. This is an agenda item in human rights, saying that violators of human rights should not be simply scolded. They should be held accountable according to the definition of impunity. And this is the special rapporteur on the subject, and in 2005 these 3 components were defined. Her job has been to work to get agreement of all countries, including India, on these 3 components. Impunity means the right to know. In other words, commissions of inquiry and other procedures allow the victims to at least have an official source of information that says, we were victims of a violation of human rights. It's documented here, it's accepted, it's proven, and if it happened during a conflict and the conflict is over, one of the ways of ensuring that is to have a commission of inquiry. If atrocities occurred during a civil war or another act of repression by the state and so on, after this occurs, impunity requires that some mechanism such as a commission of inquiry, allow the truth to come out. The victims, those people who have suffered from this, who have lost family members, who have lost their homes and so on, at a minimum, there must be accounting for the truth. That's the right to know. Secondly, is the right to justice. And that means, at the national or international level, those who are responsible must go before a judicial body to determine their criminal liability. And third, once the truth is known and the perpetrators have been identified as being guilty of the criminal behavior, the victims deserve reparation. Both the right to reparation and guarantees of non-recurrence. So the authorities of the state responsible for committing such acts must provide compensation to the reparation to the victims and provide new measures so that the acts do not occur, such as, for example, punishing police officers who commit acts of torture, training them so that it won't happen again, and making sure that the population is no longer subjected to acts of torture by the police authorities of the state. That's one example of the right to reparation and guarantees of non-recurrence. So those are the three components of combating impunity. Now, the principles of community go on in much greater detail. The United Nations principles to combat impunity have been detailed at great length in this book on the United Nations Principles to Combat Impunity, a commentary, and that's an entire book that analyzes the means by which these three principles are translated into numerous other steps that can be taken to ensure impunity. So, the obligations to take effective action are repeated in the decisions going all the way back to 2005, and the independent expert whose picture you saw in a previous slide underscored and put in her report the failure of states to investigate and to ensure that suspected criminals are brought to justice and effective remedies are applied. So these ideas, these three principles that I just mentioned, are a constant refrain of the United Nations in dealing with the question of impunity in general for violations of human rights. So there were in the body of international law, of international human rights law, impunity. But it applies to other branches of international law where there is criminal responsibility. And in the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of just a few months ago, he presented a report as requested by the Human Rights Council that looked at the range of efforts since going way back many decades to deal with human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's an overview, the human rights situation in the occupied territories. A very recent report in the middle of the current conflict. And among the conclusions in this report, he discusses the West Bank, he discusses all aspects of the occupied territories. But in his conclusion, he also focuses on Gaza, in which he talks about neither party has taken steps to ensure accountability for serious violations committed during excuse me, I'm going to take some water if I may. And impunity again. Here is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the highest official of the UN, whose daily job it is to monitor human rights around the world and to support various political bodies and legal bodies that address human rights issues. His report of last February referred to the violations of international humanitarian law, including war crimes, have been committed by all parties, and calls on all parties to implement a ceasefire to ensure full respect for international law, and so on. And impunity, coming back to our topic, also remained pervasive for incidents of unlawful use of force by Israeli security forces outside the context of the current hostilities. And here is where he launched to the world a new term. You've now, before today, with one exception, you were not familiar with the term impunity. Now you know what impunity means as a general term. The High Commissioner for Human Rights talked in his report about entrenched impunity. And what he means by this is that in the case of the occupied territories, for decades, there's been no accountability on all sides for violations over 56 years of occupation and 16 years of the blockade of Gaza. So his point here is that we're not just talking about Israeli attacks after the 7th of October of 2023. We are talking about, we are talking about 56 years of impunity for acts that are in violation of international human rights law, international humanitarian law in the Palestinian occupied territories. So, we've talked about the applicable law. You've become familiar with international criminal law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and so on. We've talked about the concept of impunity, efforts made, and the principles that exist to say that if you violate international law, the individual must be held accountable. Now, before I get into jurisdiction, as an introduction to this question of jurisdiction, where can this trial to bring about justice, to end impunity, happen? I want to distinguish between violations of public international law in relations between states. Russia invaded Ukraine. That's a violation of the UN Charter by Russia, the country of Russia, against the victim country, Ukraine. Those are two states. Israel as a state invaded Gaza in its right of self-defense and committed acts that have been led to accusations of violating international law. That's the state of Israel. You're all aware of the case that South Africa brought against Israel for, are you aware? This has been in the news. Obviously, the facts on the situation in Gaza move very fast. But how many of you are aware of the South Africa case against Israel? Anybody? Are you timid or just... No? Nobody? Oh my goodness. So, yes. Yes. That's right. Exactly. So this has been in the news, and if you're interested in following these issues, it's something that is worth following because South Africa brought a case in the International Court of Justice against Israel for violating its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This is a major development that, of course, has been denounced by Israel and the United States, in which the International Court of Justice does not have, where are we? Does not have authority to hold anybody, any individuals accountable for violating international humanitarian law or international human rights law. The International Court of Justice can only decide disputes between states. So, South Africa, oh my goodness. Gudmundur? I'm in front of a class of about 100 students talking about your subject. We're talking about jurisdiction under international courts. I was not going to take the call, but when I saw that it was you, I'm now going to be able to tell the students who is calling me and why I took the call. And I'll call you after this class, okay? She's not. No, she's at home. Okay. Talk to you later. Okay. I took the call because that's a judge on an international tribunal. He's actually a judge in a case of Ukraine against Russia before an international arbitral tribunal in The Hague. So since I have jurisdiction on the wall, on the screen, and I get a call from a judge whose job it is to decide cases where jurisdiction has been established, I took the call to introduce you to Justice Gudmundur Eriksson from Iceland. So now we're coming to the point of the case of South Africa against Israel is before the International Court of Justice, which is the highest judicial body of the United Nations, established by the UN in the Charter of the United Nations. Its statute is annexed to the UN Charter. That's a body, a judicial body, that can handle disputes between states. They cannot attack Benjamin Netanyahu or any of the leaders of Hamas and try them for any violations of international law. The Genocide Convention is an international treaty. South Africa is a party to it. Israel is a party to it. And South Africa says, you have violated your obligations under the treaty that binds both of us. Therefore, I'm asking the International Court of Justice to hold you responsible as a violator of the Geneva Convention. And so you understand the difference between personal jurisdiction and interstate jurisdiction. The ICJ case is only between states, in this case South Africa and Israel. What we're looking at now to deal with criminal liability, that form of impunity that allows individuals who order the bombing of a hospital or who shoot a prisoner of war, individuals who have committed violations of international humanitarian law, to be held criminally accountable. And there are three principal levels of jurisdiction: national courts, international tribunals, and universal jurisdiction. And the third is what we're going to be testing through the simulation. So let me say a few words about the first two. Oh, hang on. So, national courts, criminal courts, of course have jurisdiction over people who commit crimes. And if the criminal law includes crimes that also are violations of international humanitarian law, the national courts can hold persons under their personal jurisdiction, either nationals or non-nationals, accountable before the criminal courts of the state. So, an Indian official or individual commits an act of atrocity against somebody in another country or in India, the Indian courts can try that person in violation of Indian law. That's the national court. And that person who gets punished under Indian law by the Indian court has not escaped punishment, has not benefited from impunity. No. When the national courts act, you end the impunity of the perpetrator who otherwise is not punished. So, that's where you expect law to be respected at the national level. But obviously, when countries are involved in big international conflicts, they're not likely, Israel is not likely, for example, to have its criminal courts bring Netanyahu to court and say, you violated your obligations under international humanitarian law, and we're going to put you in jail. No, that's not going to happen. So what are the options when the national courts won't do it? Two options. International criminal tribunals, and that's the example that we saw with the prosecutor of the ICC asking the judges to issue an arrest warrant against the 2 senior officials of Israel and the 3 senior officials of Hamas. That's the International Criminal Court. They also have an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin. So, international criminal courts, let me get to that. I have, all right. Yes, there we go. So international criminal courts. The principal body, there was, following World War II, there were international tribunals that were established in Nuremberg and in Tokyo to try war criminals during World War II. And the expectation was, when the Genocide Convention was adopted, that there would be an international criminal court that would be established. Didn't happen. There wasn't enough political will to do it. So when crimes were committed in Rwanda and crimes were committed in former Yugoslavia, the Security Council used its authority to create tribunals to try individuals for their criminal behavior. Finally, in 1998, agreement was reached in Rome on the statute of an international criminal court with jurisdiction over all international crimes, not just crimes committed in Rwanda or in Kosovo, or other tribunals have been established concerning Cambodia and Sierra Leone and so on. Not limited. ICC has a broad range of crimes that it can cover wherever committed. And it entered into force in 2002. So since 2002, we have a criminal court internationally, the ICC, that can try cases. And as I said, these are some of the precedents, the ad hoc courts that have been established in former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, etc. And mixed tribunals have been established concerning Cambodia and Sierra Leone and so on. These are some cases in which an international court has tried individuals, held them accountable, and put them in jail for their crimes. Now, the ICC, and I'm coming back to the screen that we showed with the prosecutor of the ICC announcing that he has requested an arrest warrant against the senior officials of Israel and of Hamas. The ICC has jurisdiction under the Rome Statute for where the person accused of the crime is a national of a state party, where the crime was committed in the territory of a state party, and where the situation is referred by the Security Council. These are the ways in which this tribunal, the ICC, has jurisdiction. Now, Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute. So, Israel is not a state party. And Israel, also, the territory of Israel, is not a state party. Therefore, how can the ICC have jurisdiction? Not hearing that. No, I'm sorry. Okay. If Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute that establishes the jurisdiction of the ICC, how can the prosecutor that we saw on the screen request an arrest warrant against the Prime Minister of Israel? Yes, can you help us? But Israel is not a party. Ah, there's the key point. So, even though the creation of a state of Palestine has been contested, the United Nations has accepted the state of Palestine as an observer member of the UN. It's not a member of the UN, but in its capacity as being a semi-recognized state. Of course, Palestinian leadership considers that it is a state, and those who support Palestine consider that it is a state, but most of the European countries and the United States reject that idea. It's not a state. It's a political entity that has terrorists among them and so on. It's not a state. However, since it is the state of Palestine is an observer member of the United Nations, it used that capacity to ratify the Rome Statute. And you're quite right, because Palestine ratified the Rome Statute, it fits the criteria, it has jurisdiction, so at least the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court believes that he has jurisdiction over the case. And of course, Israel and the United States are objecting to that. Now, final point on international tribunal is that under the Rome Statute, Article 7 enumerates the crimes that can be prosecuted in the court. And it includes murder, extermination, enslavement, forcible transfer of populations, severe deprivation of liberty, torture, rape, persecution, disappearances of persons, aggression, and so on. So those, you can look at that list of crimes, and it's not going to take you very long to choose the ones that you would, if you were representing representing Palestine, that you would take to the tribunal to say Israel, these individuals in Israel, especially the government, especially the prime minister, must be held accountable for these crimes. These crimes have been committed. And so this moved forward in the case of the Ukraine. The judges issued an arrest warrant against Putin, and one final point before I move on to the next type of jurisdiction, that's the jurisdiction that you're going to use for the simulation, and that is that there's another principle that you've learned. You've learned the concept of impunity, you've learned entrenched impunity, you've learned ICC, you've learned international humanitarian law. Here's another takeaway concept for you to remember, and that's complementarity. Complementarity is a legal principle that balances the political concern of states that say, wait a minute, we don't want you coming and arresting our officials because some crazy country in another part of the world says that those individuals committed crimes. No, 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 we can take care of our own people. You're not going to come in and arrest people or have other countries arrest people for crimes that are frivolous and didn't really exist. We are a nation that has our own courts. We will try our own people. Well, the Rome Statute agreed with that. The Rome Statute said if a case is being investigated or prosecuted by a state, or if it's been investigated, or if the person has already been tried in the state, then yeah, the ICC can't do it. So, if the leadership of Hamas were tried before a Palestinian court, they don't really exist, it's not likely, or Netanyahu was tried before a court in Israel, then the principle of complementarity would say that the principle of complementarity would say this is inadmissible. The ICC cannot move this case forward. Inadmissible because you violated the principle of complementarity. It is up to the country's own national courts to take action. They are taking action. ICC has no jurisdiction. You get that principle of complementarity? That's how it works. And if you're arguing for the Swiss Criminal Tribunal not to have jurisdiction in the case, you can also argue on complementarity, saying that if there are any violations of international humanitarian law, Israel law can take care of it. It'll be handled under the principle of complementarity. So that leaves, I said, there are national courts, international criminal tribunals, and the third source of criminal responsibility for violations of international humanitarian law and other international laws protecting populations is the principle of universal jurisdiction. Now, how are we doing for time? Definition of universal jurisdiction, because the simulation is an example of universal jurisdiction. So briefly, the third way in which criminal liability can be respected and you can end impunity for crimes that are committed by individuals in a state after national courts and international tribunals is what's called universal jurisdiction. And universal jurisdiction, apologize for the long definition here, universal jurisdiction is the principle that allows a state to adjust its criminal law to say our criminal tribunals can try anybody that has committed international violations of international criminal law, has committed violations of international humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and so on. Those crimes can be tried in our national courts, example, Switzerland, even if the crime did not occur in Switzerland, the person alleged to have committed the crime is not Swiss, and the victim is not Swiss. Do you get it? That's the principle of universal jurisdiction. The ability of domestic judicial system to investigate and prosecute specific crimes, even if they were not committed on its territory. The principles around the universal jurisdiction have been clarified in a meeting we held in Princeton, at Princeton University, and we adopted the Princeton principles of universal jurisdiction. And these are what I just alluded to. It's the first principle is that it's based solely on the nature of the crime, not on where it was committed, who committed it, or who was the victim. Just the nature of the crime. And they must be serious. Piracy, slavery, war crimes, crimes against the peace, crimes against humanity, genocide, and torture. And third principle, normally the Swiss legislature should say we can try these crimes, but even without that, it's a general principle is it does not require national legislation. And I won't go into these other details. Oh, yes. So, immunities. Whether even a head of state, now this is important, of course, for the current efforts of the International Criminal Court, but it's also true for universal jurisdiction. The head of state or responsible government shall not be relieved of criminal responsibility, and statutes of limitations shall not apply. So I won't go into the other principles. So there are principles on how a country like Switzerland can try an accused person, such as the Minister of Health of Israel, for these crimes. And I'm going to skip to the final slide here. Whoops. All right. So it's interesting to note in the case of Israel that the principle of universal jurisdiction was in fact applied by Israel when it tried Adolf Eichmann for his personal role in the Holocaust that was committed during World War II. But I'm going to skip that. And the concept of universal jurisdiction has also been supported by India. India holds the firm view that those who commit crimes must be brought to justice and punished. A criminal should not go scot-free because of prosecutorial technicalities, including lack of jurisdiction. So there is a support from the government of India for the underlying principle of universal jurisdiction. And with that, the final thing I want to say is that universal jurisdiction is in fact occurring every day and has been going on for years in Switzerland and other countries. And this is all monitored by an organization called Trial International, and it has an annual review of cases that are being brought. And here's the latest report. And if you look in that report, you'll see that under Switzerland, these are a series of cases that are currently being tried by Switzerland involving Algeria and Gambia and Senegal and Syria. So these are cases like the one we're going to do now that are actually being tried before this court. This is a very famous case that I worked on concerning a head of state who was held liable by under universal jurisdiction. So with that background, you can see that the concept of impunity is fundamental to take human rights seriously, because those who commit massive violations of human rights should not be allowed to go free. The International Criminal Court is blocked in many ways because of the jurisdictional disputes, although there may be a breakthrough in the case of the prosecutor seeking an arrest warrant. But what continues to work is universal jurisdiction, and that's what we're going to observe right now. So can we ask I think I have the list of, yes. I think I put it at the beginning. So we have a judge from the Federal Criminal Court in Switzerland. The role of the judge will be to say, we have to decide if we're going to move ahead with this court. Let me ask the prosecutor, why are you bringing this case? So the judge moderates the proceedings and gives the floor to the Attorney General, who explains what he's trying to do. I want to try this man. The man being tried says, you can't try me. And the representative of the Gazan Ministry of Health says, you must try this man. Look at the horrible things that he's responsible for, destroying our hospitals. and then you have various other actors who have a role, some knowledge, and they're going to share that knowledge with the court. So can we start? Who can? We need the person playing the role of the judge of the federal court to preside and give. Are they going to move up here, or are we going to? How should we do this?
Relating to the mass violence on Gaza. Therefore, to ensure smoothness in the proceeding, I would like to call upon the Office of the Attorney General to bring on his views on the accusation of criminal responsibility that has come under the ambit of the universal jurisdiction.
Head of the Office of Attorney General. I'm here to say about the issues that has been done by the Israel. Israel is responsible for criminal because they have bombarded Gaza, and also there were many instances where there has been a crime done by the Gaza on Gaza hospitals. And also there were many crimes against the humanity and genocide against Gaza people.
Thank you. The next is Uriel Bosso, the Israeli Minister of Health. Please present your views.
If I may have permission to speak.
Yes, you may.
Your Lordship, I represent the State of Israel as the Health Minister. My name stands as Uriel Bosso, and at this point, our state has been accused of multiple activities, be it crimes against humanity, genocide, and whatnot. However, the only way we are accused of doing so is for protecting our own people and our civilization. It has been a repetitive attempt of Hamas or the leaders in power of Hamas or the leaders in power in the state of Palestine to ensure that Israel as a state does not function and we do not have anything left. In 2023, our people, our country, or our sovereignty was attacked. In response to that, we launched attack backs. And in doing so, the only point that we stand firm on is the elimination of Hamas and restoring peace in Palestine and Israel itself. However, we have been restricted in doing so, as these international agencies or international courts have accused us of infringing on the rights or the liberties of humanitarian law and human rights law. It has not been done by us. It is only a matter of their attack backs on us, depending on the fact that we have been accused as restricting medical supplies, food, and whatnot is completely baseless. Baseless, number one, because we have never done so. Yes, there have been limitations on the airstrip. There have been issues regarding to transportation. But as a nation, as a country, as a sovereign country at that, we have not done anything that would directly affect the people of Palestine. We are not against the people of Palestine. We're absolutely not. We stand firm on the ground that we stand with humanity. But perhaps the people in power, or Hamas as a whole, has been acting in such a way that it is portrayed before the World Forum that we are the villains here. The villains here are those people who have snatched away powers back in 2006. They have been using their powers, they have been misusing their powers. We are a democratically elected government. We are there by the people, we stand by the people. We have moved progressively since the 1950s, and till date we are far too ahead of our time, as one would call it. Not going into the differences, I would simply like to state that these accusations stand no ground on the simple basis that there is no factually binding evidence that directly links our activities on restricting the supply of medical emergencies or directly attacking those places. However, the attacks that have been committed on the medical grounds or the hospitals was not against the people of Palestine, but was only to eliminate the centers where the ammunitions, where the supplies or weapons of mass destruction, or not mass destruction, I would clarify. Weapons of destructions were kept only to inflict pain and suffering on people of Israel and Palestine by Hamas. That's all. I'd like to wrap up by saying that this is not a retaliative approach, but simply a protective approach that we have been following.
We have the Ministry of Health from Gaza. Please present your views. You may.
Much obliged. I'm Ashraf Al-Qudra, as the Gaza Ministry of Health spokesperson. I would like to state that the Israel troops were forcing 95 medics and 191 patients, 165 displaced people into an old building at the medical center under harsh conditions where there was without food, water, milk for children, and numerous other accusations that are violated the international humanitarian law with respect to the health facilities and personnel, which the international humanitarian law was about, which protects the victims of the armed conflict. That's it.
Minister, could you define more on what accusations of violations of international human rights law was? You mentioned that Israeli troops were forcing 95 medics, 191 patients, and 165 displaced people. What I wanted to ask you was, what are the accusations that were on these? Patients, if you have.
Pardon, Your Lordship, I'm not prepared.
All right. Operational Communications, Valerie Bebize. I guess, yes, please present your views.
From the NGOs of the MSF, that is the Medicine Sans Frontiers, we have seen in the paragraph, there are two paragraphs which says that each and every individual is also responsible to the matter where we have to shield them from genocide or armed war crimes, etc. All these crimes which we have to be protected. So we have to come together. There must be a rule and duty of citizens and as the government to protect them, to shield them from this ongoing. Thank you.
UNWRA, Philip Lazzarini, please present your views.
Your Lordship, may I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Today I'm here on behalf of the United Nations Work Relief Agency. That Gaza has been facing a lot, that I have been there, and many children has been, many newborn babies are facing limbs, and that they are facing many medical insufficient food and malnutrition. And not only that, many injured people have been injecting without any anesthesia, and many surgeries has been going on. So there is a need of solution between Palestine and Israel.
Next we have Francesca Albanese. Please present your views.
Permission to speak?
Yes, you may.
I am Francesca Albanese, the UN reporter in Palestine. Your Excellency, I would like to bring to your attention that after months of military operations, Israel has destroyed Gaza. If we talk about the figures here, then over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, 71,000 have been injured. 70% of the residential area have been destroyed, and 80% of the whole population and 80% of the whole population have been forcibly displaced. Thousands of families have lost their loved ones and have been wiped out. Many could not even bury and mourn their relatives. By analyzing the patterns of violence and Israel's policy in its onslaught on Gaza, it could be concluded that there are reasonable grounds indicating Israel's commission of genocide. So I would like to I would like to request the member states to enforce prohibition on genocide in accordance with their non-derogable obligation. Israel and those states who have been assisting in the commission of genocide must be held accountable and deliver reparation with the destruction that harm inflicted on the Palestinian people. I recommend the reconstitution of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid to comprehensively address the situation in Palestine. And I also like to recommend that the member states immediately implement an arms embargo on Israel, as it appears that it has failed to comply with the binding measures ordered by ICJ. And I recommend referring the situation in Palestine to the ICC immediately in support of its ongoing investigation, and ensure that the United Nations Relief and Work Agency is properly funded to enable it to meet the increased needs of Palestinians in Gaza.
President of the International Committee of Red Cross, please present your views. President of the International Committee of Red Cross, please present your views. Presented their briefs on the trial that we have just had to all the views that has been presented by the member councils. Therefore, I would like to address this situation and would bring a positive solution towards all the issues that have been brought forward to the court. Thank you. Positions, I would like to put this trial to hold Uriel Busso criminally liable for alleged crimes committed by Israel in Gaza.
I have a chance to defend myself.
Yes, you may.
Your Lordship, I would simply like to state that there were no points made that directly link my role in this. However, it was clarified that only the fact that bombings took place which eliminated a hospital, which we regrettably say that contained people, civilians, even when we did not want to injure them, was not our intent.
But Council, the
There is
Ministry...
also a lack in representation. There is also a lack in representation by certain members before this court. Even the members sitting over here have not placed their points in order, which I would like to state.
But Council, the Ministry of Health have mentioned that 95 medics and 191 patients were forced. So therefore, there stands a reasonable ground to consider you as responsible for the
Your Lordship, could you please repeat? They were 90 patients?
Council, the Ministry of Health spokesperson mentioned that there were around 95 medics and 191 patients that who were forced and kept under harsh conditions. So therefore, there is a reasonable ground of belief to consider this fact to hold you responsible for the conflict.
Your Lordship, to my understanding, the hospital is in the area of Palestine, which is under direct control of the Palestinian government. So them being kept under harsh conditions directly falls upon their government and not ours. However, regarding the attack, we wholeheartedly regret it. But it was perhaps not against them, but the people or the militants over there. They only served as collateral damage, which we regret.
Do you have any substantial evidence to make yourself not criminally liable for this? Other than the points you have just stated.
The statements are made already, Your Lordship, and that stands as firm as it is possible. We do not say that the attack was not done. The attack was done, but only to eliminate the military personnel. However, this court is free to believe what it wants to believe.
Since Uriel Busso has stated some factual points on the above, therefore I would like all the councils to bring more substantial evidence for their views to be presented in the court. Therefore, for now, I would bring up to this matter that we would not proceed with the trial as of now until unless substantial evidences are brought forward. know. Therefore, I would like to adjourn the matter for now, and until and as substantial evidences are put forward, we would pronounce the judgment in regard to that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Excellent, excellent job. Excellent job. So I hope this has given you an opportunity. These names, by the way, are real people. These are, I couldn't find the name of the judge, so I have to use your name, I guess. I don't know. You'll be the judge. But all of these are the actual people. The Attorney General is Stefan Blatter and Uriel Bosso and Ashraf, etc. These are real people. Thank you all very much for taking on these roles. One of the things that struck me in your efforts to portray what these people would say before the tribunal, in the criminal tribunal in Switzerland, the Attorney General said, Israel is responsible for this. And Bosso said that our state of Israel has been accused. Our state has been accused. And the special rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, said that Israel is destroying Gaza, and so on. Now, given this context that we're operating in under universal jurisdiction, what do you think is, I don't want to say wrong, but what do you think is could be a little bit better about those? Again, I'm repeating the point, is the Attorney General said Israel is responsible. The accused said our state has been defending itself, and so collateral damage, our state. I'm going to come to your conclusion at the end of saying there's not enough evidence at this point. But what we're trying to do here is to give you an opportunity to understand that one of the responses to impunity is to get at the truth and to hold those responsible liable for their acts, and to utilize criminal procedures to hold them accountable. Those criminal procedures are national courts, international tribunals, universal jurisdiction. We're under the third one here, using universal jurisdiction. For what? Is the purpose of what we're doing here the same as South Africa's purpose in the International Court of Justice in The Hague? We saw that South Africa presented its case before the International Court of Justice and said Israel is responsible. Here, the Attorney General said Israel is responsible. Seems to be the same thing. What's going on here? I thought one was an interstate dispute in which you want a state to be found guilty. Universal jurisdiction is not an interstate dispute. There's no case of Israel against Switzerland. It's not a case, what is the difference here that you're missing when you say this is a case of Israel being responsible? Anybody get the point that I'm making? I think you get the point I'm making, I think. Could you clarify it to the rest of the audience?
So the basic agenda at hand of liability on the Minister of Health of Israel, which was different.
The liability of Israel?
Liability of the Minister of Health of
Yes,
Israel.
there. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So, do you want to clarify it? Finish your sentence.
Yes, sir. So basically, it was on the Minister of Health and his activities which have led to the people in Gaza, the people who are in the hospital, to be affected by the lack of medical facilities and whatnot, since the Gaza Strip is under the control of the Israel military. However, the minister was held liable because The flow of medicines is through the minister.
Yeah.
But when the Secretary General went ahead pointing out that it was in regards to the state of Israel, the response was formulated in a different way.
Yeah.
But the agenda at hand was completely different.
Very good, very good. So I just want to make sure that we all come away understanding that what we're addressing here is impunity, criminal liability for impunity, 3 levels at which that's done, and the criminal liability is to hold an individual criminally liable. So when you say Israel is responsible, that's what you do when you're South Africa going before the ICJ. But if you're the Attorney General attacking the Minister of Health of Israel and holding him accountable, it's not Israel has attacked, is that this individual is responsible because of his role in the government of Israel. He sat in the cabinet when they decided, we are going to attack this hospital. We think there's Hamas in the hospital. Yes, there will be civilian victims. We don't care because we're going to get Hamas. It's his liability, not Israel's liability. ICJ decides Israel's liability for genocide. Swiss court or any other court exercising universal jurisdiction decides on an individual's liability. And what's interesting in this case, and I'm sure you grasp that, is that you saw that for the criminal responsibility before the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor chose the Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, I think it is, I forget but very senior people directly responsible for the decisions. This case was deliberately complicated by the fact that we chose the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health could also say, look, these are the military decisions are made by the others. My job is just to deal with the health. And in fact, we help lots of Palestinians who cross the border and our hospitals take care of them and so on. Why do you want to attack me? And what adds to that, and what's an interesting fact, is that actually this individual, Bosso, has traveled to Geneva for the World Health Organization, and he met with the Secretary General, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and in the reports of his meeting, he seemed to be very much along the lines of the leadership of Israel, because in the entire conversation, all he talked about is, I want you, Director General of UNESCO, to condemn the Palestinians for what they did on the 7th of October. That was a crime, that was criminals. No reference to the fact that it's Hamas's fault, but there are health problems, we need to work on it. The World Health Organization has people on the ground, let's make sure that those people, no, nothing. It was only accusing the World Health Organization of not denouncing. So that makes the case a little better to say Bosso could be held responsible. But of course, as you quite rightfully pointed out, why him? That's not the real culprits here that should be criminally responsible are the ones that are currently being, at least an attempt is being made to issue an arrest warrant against them in the International Criminal Court. But, so the main takeaway, I'm admiring all of you on your efforts to present the positions that you see there, but the main weakness, I think, is that you seem to miss the point that we're going after an individual to throw him in jail for crimes, not the state of Israel. Obviously, they're connected. It's because the state of Israel has committed these crimes that we're holding the individual responsible. But that's the big difference. You have to understand the difference between individual criminal responsibility and responsibility of the state for its obligations. Responsibility of the state goes before the International Court of Justice, state versus state. Criminal responsibility goes to an individual before a criminal court, a judge, and a prosecutor against the individual. I think you gather that because that's clear in the understanding of international criminal law. Now, have we exhausted the time, or can I talk about R2P? We've used the time. There's another new concept. You've learned the concept of impunity, you've learned the concept of universal jurisdiction, you've learned the concept of international humanitarian law, international criminal law, international human rights law. Another concept that's relevant here is the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect. And the underlying idea here is that the Security Council cannot, we saw the resolution that it adopted, it can say, we want all governments to respect international law, including international humanitarian law and so on. But it did not say, Israel, stop. Israel, immediately have a ceasefire, because of the veto. In order to resolve that dilemma, the UN adopted in 2005 at the World Summit, 5 years after the Millennial Declaration in the year 2000, the World Summit document, the heads of state and government affirmed their responsibility to protect their own populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and accepted collective responsibility to encourage and help each other uphold that commitment. So here's a new concept of how do we address mass atrocities. We've seen how we do it in interstate conflicts. We've seen how we do it in international criminal responsibility. We've seen the concept of immunity, of impunity, and entrenched impunity in the case of Gaza. The point that I'm making here is there's another concept of international law, that is the concept of responsibility to protect, that seeks to get at the root causes. Not to say, after the fact, you did it, you're going to go to court for your crimes. No, this is to say, Israel and Russia and India all have a responsibility to protect their populations. That's their job, and we respect them to do that. But what is the reality? If we look at what happened in Syria, Libya, Myanmar, DRC, Ukraine, Gaza, the responsibility to protect was meaningless. Where are these people protecting their populations from that list of crimes? So here is the structure of responsibility to protect. In that document that I referred to, the decision that was made in 2005 to try to solve the problem of root causes by saying all countries accept their responsibility to protect their populations. It begins with the individual state, has the responsibility to protect its problem from all of these things and prevent such crimes. We accept this responsibility, and will act accordingly. This is what was adopted by all the governments in the summit. We will not let this happen. We will not let these crimes take place on our territory. That's our responsibility. The next paragraph is the critical one. The international community, through the UN, has the responsibility to use diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. You get that? So, the state has accepted responsibility not to do this. If it's failing to do that, the international community says, hang on, we can help. Listen to us. We want to help you. Israel, listen. We've got some concerns here. We will take diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means. So Israel, listen. We're sending humanitarian help here. Help these people. Allow our humanitarian aid to get in. Stop committing these acts. Obviously, that's not been enough, right? In this context, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council in accordance with the Charter. And what this means is there are three pillars to R2P, and I'm going to conclude with that. And in fact, if you want to read about the history of it, I authored an article on that. It was published in the Jindal Global Law Review. Pillar 1, that's the one we saw in paragraph 138. The state says, we'll protect our people, don't worry about it, we agree. Pillar 2, we're having troubles. The international community says, here's international aid. Here's the head of our state is coming to your prime minister and saying, you've got to have a ceasefire. You've got to do something. That's pillar 2. Pillar 3 is the decisive action that requires the Security Council to act in accordance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which means that you need a vote of the Security Council that can take decisive action, that can say, we order Israel to stop immediately, and we authorize member states under the leadership of whatever they want to designate to take sanctions against Israel, to blockade Israel, to arrest Israeli officials and try them for crimes, whatever can be taken. But that can only be taken by the Security Council, and it's subject to the veto. So that's the reason why I call this a watershed or old wine in a new bottle. In fact, we're back to where we were. The Security Council cannot act if you don't get the unanimous support of the Security Council. R2P was developed as a way to say, come on, governments, let's do better. We can do better. And this has been effective in some cases. There have been cases in which invoking R2P, and even mentioning it in the Security Council resolutions, has led governments to change their behavior. In the case of Russia and the case of Israel in Gaza, it has failed. So the question becomes, is responsibility to protect a new direction in which the international community is saying, we have to stop these conflicts at their source, or is it the same thing as before? We're stymied by the requirements of the Security Council. And in fact, the UN has tried to deal with this. The Secretary General has issued many reports on timely and decisive response, implementing responsibility to protect, state responsibility and prevention, mobilizing collective action the next decade of the responsibility to protect. They're desperate. We can't get this to work. And all of these efforts have been to try to make it, to try to implement the responsibility to protect and find accountability for that. So early warning to early action, all these efforts to make the responsibility to protect make a difference and prevent things like the situation in Gaza from occurring. And that's the application of the Syrian thing from the report. But so just to let you know what's happening, there is an organization called the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect that has developed a toolkit for this purpose that outlines, you can access this cool toolkit very easily, and it has addressed situations in the work of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. It has addressed the situation in Israel and the occupied territories. War crimes are occurring, including crimes against humanity and the crime of apartheid. But of course, that's simply saying, yes, R2P should apply there, but it is not being applied. So with that fairly disappointing conclusion, let me add a ray of hope, is that impunity is being reduced by the proper functioning of the International Court of Justice in taking up the case concerning the Genocide Convention, of the International Criminal Court that is has issued arrest warrants against Putin and will probably issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu and others in Gaza and Israel. And however, the weak point in all these efforts to stop massive atrocity crimes, the weak point is R2P. It's not occurring. It's going to require brilliant young lawyers like yourself to move this agenda forward and in your professional careers to make a difference. Thank you very much for your time.